Welcome to Avoidant Decoded, a space where we gently uncover the hidden language of emotions that are often felt deeply but rarely expressed clearly. If you're someone seeking clarity in confusing connections, you're not alone and you're in the right place. Consider becoming a member of this channel to go deeper into understanding patterns that most people never learn to see. Let's begin this journey of insight together. There's a kind of connection that doesn't confuse you because it's empty, but because it's deeply felt and never clearly spoken. You start questioning your own reality, wondering how something so intense can feel so uncertain at the same time. But what if the silence, the mixed signals, and the contradictions were never absence, just a different language of emotion? Today, we're going to uncover what's really being said beneath the words you thought meant nothing. I want to share something that took me years of closely observing avoidant patterns, especially in clinical environments, to fully understand. Once you truly see it, it's not something you can unsee. And once it clicks, it completely shifts the way you interpret all those confusing, mixed, or emotionally disorienting moments you've experienced with an avoidant person. The moments where you start questioning if what you felt was even real. The truth is, the way avoidant individuals experience and express love does not follow the pattern most people assume is standard. For someone with a secure attachment style, feelings and expression usually move together. Emotions grow, communication follows, and even though vulnerability may feel uncomfortable, it still happens. When love is expressed, it's often direct, clear, and something you can trust without overanalyzing. With avoidance, the process works almost in reverse. The feeling still develops, and often it runs much deeper than people expect. In many cases, the emotional intensity is actually very strong. The difference is not in the absence of love, but in what happens to that love once it exists. Instead of naturally moving outward into expression, the feeling turns inward. It gets contained. The stronger the emotion becomes, the more the avoidance system tries to manage it, suppress it, or disguise it in safer forms. Love doesn't come out directly. It gets filtered through indirect behaviors and subtle communication that feels less exposing. This is exactly why interacting with an avoidant person can feel so confusing. It's not because they don't feel anything. It's because their emotions are translated into a different kind of language. And if you're trying to understand them using direct emotional expression as your reference point, you'll almost always misread what's actually being communicated. So what I want to do is help you understand that language, the small, everyday things they say that seem ordinary on the surface, but carry much deeper meaning underneath. These are not obvious confessions. They are quiet signals, often hidden in casual remarks that most people overlook. One of the first signs shows up when an avoidant starts making very specific, unsolicited observations about you. At first, these comments can sound critical or overly analytical, even when they're not meant to hurt you. It can feel unnecessary or slightly dismissive on the surface. But something much deeper is happening. When an avoidant begins noticing the smallest details about you, how you hold your coffee, the subtle difference in your voice when you're genuinely excited versus when you're just going through the motions, the tiny inconsistencies in your behavior, they are not being detached. They are becoming highly attentive in a way they don't fully control. And when they express these observations, it often comes out sideways. It might sound like critique instead of appreciation. But that level of attention is never neutral. People don't study the fine details of someone they feel nothing for. That kind of awareness only shows up when someone has quietly become important in their inner world. The problem is, an avoidant person doesn't feel safe saying, "I notice everything about you because you matter to me." That level of openness feels too vulnerable. So instead, that awareness turns into commentary, and what is actually admiration gets hidden inside restraint. Another phrase you will often hear is some version of, "I'm not good at this." On the surface, it sounds like a simple disclaimer. Sometimes it even feels like a warning, as if they're telling you they might struggle with closeness or eventually pull away. A lot of people interpret this as disinterest or emotional distance, and in some situations it can be. But very often, especially when it's said in a moment of connection, it means something else entirely. It's not a lack of feeling, it's an admission of internal conflict. It's them recognizing that something real is happening, but also knowing they don't fully know how to handle it. Instead of saying, "This matters to me and it scares me," they say, "I'm not good at this." It's a safer way to express vulnerability without fully exposing it. This is the core pattern you need to understand. Avoidant individuals don't lack emotion. They translate it differently. Their system is designed to protect them from emotional exposure, not to eliminate feeling altogether. And once you begin to see that, their behavior starts to make a lot more sense. The contradictions, the mixed signals, the moments that felt confusing, they're not random. They're structured, they're patterned, and they're often saying far more than what appears on the surface. When that phrase shows up during moments of growing closeness, it usually carries a much deeper meaning than it seems. It's rarely about rejection. More often, it reflects a quiet fear of not being enough. It's the closest many avoidant individuals come to expressing something like, "I want to love you the right way, but I'm not sure I know how." There's a kind of vulnerability hidden inside that statement. Even if they don't fully recognize it themselves, they are internally measuring the connection, sensing its weight, and wondering if they can live up to it. That kind of self-evaluation doesn't happen with people they feel nothing for. It only appears when the relationship has already started to matter. You don't question whether you're enough for someone you don't care about. That concern only exists when losing them feels possible, when the connection has real emotional value. So when you hear that hesitation, it's not always distance. Sometimes it's the pressure of something real. Another phrase that reveals even more is when they say, "You're different." It can come out in many ways. Sometimes it's soft, almost admiring. Other times it sounds cautious, like your presence is slightly unsettling. And sometimes it's mentioned casually, as if it doesn't carry much weight. But regardless of how it's said, it matters. Avoidant individuals often rely on familiar emotional patterns to feel in control. They tend to place people into categories that allow them to predict interactions and maintain a sense of distance. When someone fits into those patterns, it's easier for them to engage without feeling overwhelmed. But when someone doesn't fit, something shifts internally. "You're different" is often the first sign that you've disrupted that system. It means you are no longer being processed as just another familiar experience. You've become something more personal, less predictable, and much harder for them to manage from a distance. And that's where things start to feel complicated for them. Because difference creates two things at once. It makes emotional closeness harder to regulate, but also harder to ignore. What looks like hesitation, mixed signals, or even casual remarks is often just the surface layer of something much deeper happening underneath. The reality is, avoidant individuals don't lack emotion. What they lack is a safe way to express it without feeling exposed, and this is where real understanding begins. It's about learning to hear what isn't being said directly, but is still being communicated in subtle ways. This is something that only becomes clear after spending a long time observing these patterns closely. And once it clicks, it changes how you see every confusing interaction you've had. All those moments where you replay conversations in your head, wondering if what you felt was ever truly mutual. Because the truth is, avoidant attachment doesn't operate the way most people expect love to work. They don't feel something and then naturally express it. In more secure dynamics, emotion and communication tend to move together. Feelings grow and expression follows. Vulnerability might feel uncomfortable, but it's still accessible. And when love is spoken, it's clear enough that you don't have to constantly decode it. With avoidance, the structure is almost reversed. The feeling still forms, and often it runs deeper than people realize. But instead of expanding outward, it turns inward. It gets contained. The stronger the feeling becomes, the more their internal system tries to control it, suppress it, or reshape it into something safer. Love doesn't disappear, it gets translated, and that's where most misunderstandings begin. Because avoidant individuals don't express love in obvious ways. They express it indirectly, in fragments, in controlled behaviors that rarely look like what they actually mean. If you try to interpret those behaviors using direct emotional language, you'll almost always misread what's happening underneath. So the real shift is learning how to translate it. One of the earliest signs shows up as unexpected observations, comments that might feel slightly uncomfortable or overly analytical. Sometimes they sound like criticism, even when that's not the intention. In the early stages of attachment, an avoidant begins to notice details most people overlook. The way you hold something as simple as a cup. The subtle difference in your voice when you're genuinely excited compared to when you're just going through the motions. The small inconsistencies between what you say and what you do. These are intimate patterns that most people only recognize after a long time, but the avoidant picks up on them early. And when they speak about them, it often comes out indirectly. It can sound more like critique than connection. But that level of attention is never random. It means you've entered their internal focus. You're no longer just background. You've become someone they are actively observing, trying to understand, and mentally tracking in detail. And that kind of attention only happens when someone has become emotionally significant in a way they can't easily ignore, even if they don't fully understand it themselves. At a certain point, they reach a level of awareness they can't comfortably admit, even to themselves. No one studies the smallest details of a person who means nothing to them. That level of attention is already a form of attachment, just without the permission to call it that. So instead of openly saying, "I notice everything about you," their mind reshapes it into something safer. It turns into observations, comments, sometimes even light criticism, because that feels less exposing than telling the truth directly. Another signal appears in the phrase, "I'm not good at this." On the surface, it sounds like a warning, or a way to lower expectations before anything goes wrong. It can easily be taken as emotional distance or lack of interest. But in many real situations, especially when closeness is starting to build, it carries a completely different meaning. It is often the closest they can get to being vulnerable in that moment. What they are really expressing is, "I want to handle this connection well, but I'm afraid I might not be able to." There is a quiet self-evaluation happening underneath that statement. They are comparing what the connection feels like to what they believe they can offer. That kind of internal pressure doesn't show up for people they don't care about. It only appears when the possibility of loss becomes real, which means the attachment is already there. You don't worry about being enough for someone who doesn't matter to you. That fear only exists when someone does. Then there's the phrase, "you're different." It sounds simple, but it carries a lot more weight than it seems. It can be said in a soft, almost appreciative way, or with hesitation, as if that difference is slightly unsettling. Sometimes it's said casually, almost as if it's not important at all. But regardless of how it's delivered, it signals something significant. Avoidant individuals often rely on mental categories to keep relationships predictable and manageable. When someone fits into a familiar pattern, it's easier for them to stay emotionally regulated. But when someone doesn't fit, that system starts to lose its grip. "You're different" is what it sounds like when they can no longer place you into a known category. It means you've become something that doesn't follow their usual expectations, something that requires them to adapt instead of repeating old patterns. That shift creates emotional complexity. And for someone with avoidant tendencies, that kind of disruption is not small. It touches the deepest parts of how they manage closeness. Another revealing statement is, "I don't need anyone." When this shows up in the middle of a deepening connection, it's rarely a statement of truth. More often, it reflects the opposite. It's not independence being expressed. It's dependence being noticed and immediately resisted. Something has already changed internally. Thoughts about you begin to appear without effort. Your absence becomes more noticeable than it used to be. Emotional neutrality starts to shift, and that shift feels like a loss of control. So the system reacts by reinforcing a story of self-sufficiency. Not because it's accurate in that moment, but because it helps restore a sense of stability. The resistance itself is a sign that attachment has already formed. Another signal is quieter, but often more meaningful than anything they say directly. It shows up in how they protect you without announcing it, not through big gestures or clear declarations, but through small, consistent actions. They reduce friction for you, make things easier in subtle ways, support you when you're not even aware of it, or take on inconvenience so you don't have to. And they do all of this without labeling it as care, because putting words to it would expose the vulnerability behind it. But behavior often reveals what words cannot. And when that kind of quiet protection happens repeatedly, it becomes one of the clearest expressions of attachment they can offer without stepping outside their comfort zone. They may not say how they feel, but they show it in how they act. At the same time, it's important to hold a balanced perspective. Learning to understand this indirect form of communication can be helpful. It can stop you from misinterpreting silence as indifference or distance as rejection. It allows you to recognize what is actually there instead of assuming there is nothing. But understanding is not the same as receiving. There is a limit to how long one person should have to interpret what the other cannot express clearly. At some point, connection needs to move out of translation and into direct experience. Love should not require constant decoding just to feel secure. Avoidant individuals are capable of becoming more open and direct, but that shift requires internal work they have to choose for themselves. It means facing the very patterns that made vulnerability feel unsafe in the first place. That is not something a partner can do for them. What remains in your control is clarity, seeing what is truly being communicated without denying it, and without turning it into something more than it is. Because what you felt in those moments, in the space between their words, inside the contradictions, within the attention, the hesitation, and the quiet care, it was real. Not always clear, not always consistent, not always easy to hold on to, but real. And recognizing that truth does not mean you have to stay. In the end, avoidant love is not the absence of feeling. It is feeling that has been filtered, controlled, and expressed in indirect ways. What looks like distance, inconsistency, or emotional confusion is often attachment trying to exist behind protective walls. But understanding that doesn't mean you are meant to decode it forever. It simply means you can finally see what was real beneath the silence without losing yourself in the process. Because love that always needs interpretation may still be love, but it is not always a place where you can safely rest. What makes this dynamic even more complex is how easily it can pull the other person into a cycle of overthinking. When communication is indirect, the mind naturally tries to fill in the gaps. You start analyzing tone, timing, small behavioral shifts, and unspoken signals, trying to piece together something that was never clearly stated. Over time, this creates a kind of emotional exhaustion, not because there is nothing there, but because what is there requires constant interpretation. For the avoidant person, this isn't intentional manipulation. It's a learned way of staying emotionally safe. At some point in their past, closeness may have felt overwhelming, unreliable, or even unsafe. So their system adapted by creating distance, not necessarily physical distance, but emotional distance. The paradox is that they can still feel deeply, sometimes even more intensely than others, but they don't trust the expression of those feelings. This creates a split experience. Internally, there can be strong attachment, curiosity, and even longing. Externally, there can be hesitation, inconsistency, or silence. To someone on the receiving end, it feels like mixed signals. To the avoidant, it feels like trying to manage something that could easily become too much. Another layer to this is control. Emotional expression, especially direct vulnerability, feels like a loss of control to someone with avoidant tendencies. When they care about someone, that sense of control becomes even more important because now there is something to lose. So instead of moving closer in a visible way, they often try to maintain balance by holding parts of themselves back. This is why you might notice moments where they come closer, show interest, engage deeply, and then suddenly pull back. It's not always about you or something you did. It's often an internal regulation process. They move toward connection until it feels intense, then create distance to stabilize themselves again. At the same time, there are often subtle patterns of consistency hidden underneath what looks like inconsistency. They may not express feelings openly, but they show up in ways that are steady if you look closely. They remember small details. They respond in quiet but meaningful ways. They stay connected in indirect forms even when they're not being emotionally expressive. The challenge is that this kind of connection requires patience and emotional awareness, but it should not require you to abandon your own needs. Understanding someone's pattern can bring clarity, but it should not lead to self-neglect. There is a difference between recognizing depth and accepting a lack of reciprocity. It's also important to understand that avoidant patterns are not fixed. They are adaptive, which means they can change. But change only happens when the person becomes aware of their own behavior and is willing to face the discomfort of being more open. No amount of understanding from the outside can replace that internal decision. What often helps is creating an environment that feels emotionally safe without becoming overwhelming. This means not forcing vulnerability, not demanding immediate clarity, but also not accepting complete emotional unavailability. It's a balance between allowing space and maintaining your own standards for connection. There is also a deeper truth here that many people overlook. Just because someone feels something deeply does not automatically mean they can express it in a way that sustains a healthy relationship. Feeling and functioning are two different things. Someone can care about you and still not be able to meet you in the way you need. That's why clarity matters so much. Not just clarity about them, but clarity about yourself. What you need, what you are willing to accept, and what kind of connection actually supports your well-being. When you understand both sides, their internal world and your own, you stop getting lost in the confusion. And when you reach that point, something shifts. You no longer feel the need to chase clarity from them because you already see what is there. You can recognize the care without needing it to be constantly proven, but you can also recognize the limitations without trying to fix them. This is where real emotional maturity comes in, being able to hold two truths at once, that something can be meaningful and still not be enough, that someone can feel deeply and still not be able to show up fully. That connection can be real and still not be the right place for you to stay. Understanding avoidant behavior gives you insight, but it also gives you choice. It allows you to respond instead of react, to see patterns instead of getting caught in confusion, and to decide what aligns with you instead of trying to decode everything endlessly. In the end, the goal is not just to understand them, it's to understand the dynamic as a whole, including your role in it. Because once you see it clearly, you stop questioning your reality, and you start making decisions from a place of awareness rather than uncertainty. What feels like confusion is often just a language you were never taught to understand. Avoidant love is not empty, it is simply unspoken, hidden beneath layers of protection and fear of exposure. When you learn to see beyond the words and recognize the meaning behind the silence, everything begins to make sense. And perhaps the greatest clarity is this: not every deep feeling is expressed directly, but that does not make it any less real. It only makes it harder to recognize.